I'll begin as it warms up. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure, as always, to be back in Donegal, and it's great that Donegal is still in the championship. You'll be, as I always tell you, though I'm from Kerry and I wear the green and gold, so I'm afraid if Donegal goes too far, I won't be up for them. I think it's important to frame the debate not so much in terms of hard decisions, because there are lots of very obvious decisions that have to be made, but rather in terms of choice. In other words, that given the constraints, the external constraints on Ireland, and given the fiscal gap, we have to look at what are the choices that are still within our own hands. What choices can we make, and what should frame the choices that are made in Ireland? Can we also turn those constraints into opportunity, and can we tackle some issues in Ireland that we should have tackled many years ago but didn't because money was plentiful? And there's no doubt that the politics of austerity are always highly contested and always full of conflict. Individuals, families, pressure groups, public agencies all fight to ensure that the costs of adjustment fall on others rather than on themselves. And defensiveness becomes the order of the day. Everyone understands that there has to be cuts, and the usual refrain is, I know we need to cut back, but. And the but is always followed by the justification why this cut should never and could never be made because the consequences are very serious. And in most cases, the but really matters. There are good reasons to spend public money, but the trouble is we actually are going to have less. We already have, and so therefore reducing the fiscal deficit is absolutely essential. And therefore we have to think of it in terms of the choice. And we also have to think of it in terms of we are in a society where we are still very fearful and pessimistic. These are the latest Eurobarometer data, and the green at the end, the 84%, is the Irish bar. 84% of respondents in Ireland felt that the economic situation was very bad. More importantly, they don't think that the worst is over. We're third. Only the Greeks and the Portuguese are more pessimistic than we are. 72% of the Irish still think that the worst is to come. And when asked about the situation in terms of their personal jobs, the average across the EU in terms of numbers of people who think that they may be in difficulty is 6%. In Ireland, it's 29%. So it's very high. In other words, we're in a society where we're all very fearful of our futures. And I think that one of the first things the government has to do by the end of this year is ensure that it tells us broadly what we're likely to expect on the taxation side. What are we likely to expect in terms of if it's a property tax or water charges, or what is it? Because telling us to spend at the moment is a waste of time. Reducing personal debt and saving for an uncertain future is a very rational human response to what's going on in the society. So telling us to spend is not going to create a consumer reaction in Ireland at the moment. So I think we then have to ask if the government then needs to be able to communicate to us as a society what they think the next 3 years is like, because the uncertainty and the fear at the moment means that we're all unsure. And even though there's still a high proportion of the society of those of working age at work, there are a cohort of people at work in Ireland are very fearful for their future. So I think, again, one of the choices that needs to be made is to map where the balances are. As well as that, we've got to accept that there are trade-offs between taxation and expenditure, between cuts on capital and recurrent, between certain kinds of services than others, between certain kinds of agencies and others. Public expenditures that we could afford 3 years ago, we can no longer afford, but countries don't go into receivership, unlike companies. Countries must be managed, societies have to be steered, and we have to maintain a level of social cohesion and confidence in our future. And again, the new government has put in place the preparatory work for the choices ahead, the comprehensive review of expenditure, the David spoke about is completed, but the government departments, or the government is now working its way through that expenditure review to look at where the choices should be. And I would argue that it is, unlike David, I think it's the first big public test of the new government and big public test of our public institutions in terms of whether they have an ability to prioritise, to act with urgency and to act with energy in terms of moving beyond legacy budgets and what I would call the juggernaut of the past. I also think it's the first big test of the new Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, because given the level of cuts envisaged, it's vital that the government also develops a narrative about the choices. And in terms of framing choices, where should the government look to frame the choices? Well, I looked at some data recently, and it's very interesting in terms of what David has just said. The OECD has produces what's called government at a glance. And for the first time ever, it's included compensation levels for different jobs in the public sector across Europe. And it makes for really interesting reading. These are, if you look at those blue spikes, those are the salary levels of medical consultants. Now, I just point you to the highest blue spike, because the country that pays its medical consultants more than 32 countries in Europe is Ireland. Now, that's an extraordinary fact, and I have data for all of the others in terms of, and I guarantee you that if they did it for university professors, we'd also be nicely high on the bar. So I'm not excluding my own profession. But what really matters in a time of crisis is that Robert Dahl, one of the great students of democracy, said that politics was a sideshow in the circus of life. But politics is not a sideshow in the circus of life in a crisis. Then politics really matters to all of us, and the political choices made will make a big difference to our future. But if you go on to look at that international benchmarking across those jobs, I'm going to bring you down to one table that explains all of them. And these are the categories that they deal with. So Irish medical consultants are the highest paid in Europe. Secondary teachers are the 5th highest of 32 states. Nurses are the 4th highest. Central government senior managers are the 6th highest. Middle-ranking civil servants, the 6th highest. Executive secretaries in the civil service, the 8th highest. Now, we had what we called benchmarking in this country. It was benchmarking between, and it was very poor benchmarking between the public and private. But benchmarking against international standards is a really important part of the toolkit of government. And we must ask, given that profile, does the state and Irish society, does it get the public services, the responsiveness, the value for money that is justified by that level of investment? Why is it that we can't take on vested interests in this country? Why is it that we had a situation in our hospitals where we simply, within 2 weeks of the shift on the junior doctor cycle, that this country simply didn't have enough junior doctors? That wouldn't happen in the Netherlands, nor would it happen in the Nordic states that David mentioned. And we also know, for example, that if you benchmark the number of consultants in this country, there are fewer consultants in this country per head of population than elsewhere. Again, because they're too expensive. So because of what we spend, we cannot have a consultant-led health system in this country. But I think it's also important to look at the countries on that right side that pay more highly than we do. And what's interesting is you don't find the same countries in all of the boxes. So Luxembourg pays its nurses and teachers and doctors really well. But it doesn't pay its civil servants as much, nor its middle-ranking civil servants as much. Equally, the US pays its nurses very well, but and it pays its middle-ranking civil servants very well. But Ireland, we're in all of the boxes at a very high level. And I think we need to tackle this, and we need to face up to that. And that's not, I'm not advocating, I'm not going to say much about or say anything about Croke Park today. But those international benchmarks matter. And I come back to what David said about the Nordic states. Frequently in this country, we hold up the Nordic states as states that are well governed, good public services, They are not low cost. One of the reasons that's often given for our salaries in Ireland is our cost of living is high. But the reality is the cost of living in the Nordic states is very high. But they have very good public services. But they don't pay. They're not in those boxes. And we need to ask ourselves, why is that? And one of the problems of our public institutions in Ireland, and I say this as someone who spent 6 years as a dean in a university, that so much of our annual budget goes on our pay budget that we never have enough left over in Ireland to actually do the job, to run our institutions properly, to have the services. So I think when the choices are made, and I'm not advocating large-scale reductions, but we do need to fess up and face up to the fact that we have, over the last 10 years, put ourselves into categories that we weren't 10 years ago in terms of compensation levels. And if we hold up the Nordic as a model, then we must take all of it and not the bits of it that we like. I think there's also, so that's one area of choice. This is another table that I think tells us something about some of the choices that we face. This is poverty rates in Ireland on the life cycle and vulnerable groups. And one thing a society should aspire to do and do in a time of crisis is to care for the most vulnerable. But then it gets very tricky. When you look at this, what you clearly see is that there are two categories of the most vulnerable. Children. Children rate very highly in terms of the consistent poverty rate. In terms of share of the poverty population, 39%. Jobless households. Households that have no one at work, again, very high, and then people facing particular disabilities. But one of the categories there, older people, don't constitute any longer in Ireland a major part of those in consistent poverty. In other words, that the increases in benefits over the last 10 to 15 years brought most older Irish people out of poverty, and that's a good thing. But then there is an intergenerational issue here. If there are balances between the old and the young, then as a society, where are those trade-offs, and how should they be framed and discussed as a society? And again, I think one needs to look at all of the benefits that are there and entitlements there. Do we need to target much more carefully at those who can't afford, as opposed to universal benefits? I say that for child benefit and other benefits. But these, again, are the choices that we're now faced with. And they're tough, because no one wants less. No one wants to do an entitlement is something that one thinks, yes, I am, the very word entitlement. But we've got to focus much more carefully in that. I think, again, the whole issue of unemployment, and of course, if this was, and these are 2008 figures, if jobless houses were a major problem then we know it has accelerated since then, and we've more and more people falling into longer-term unemployment. And here again, I think there's a particular concern, and we should have a particular concern for the younger age cohort. I think it was Brendan Walsh in a study recently concluded that only 50% of the age cohort 20 to 24 in young men in Ireland were classified as employed. We've got to really watch what's happening that age cohort, because unless they are given life opportunities, then as a society we're going to have lots and lots of trouble ahead. And that brings me to the whole area of balances between benefits and activation, how automatic benefits should be, what are the costs to someone if they don't engage in training and education, and all of this. And we need to get much tougher on a lot of these issues. And again, it's not easy. Joan Burton tried to introduce a debate on it. I think her language was most unfortunate. No one wants, for no one is it a lifestyle choice to be unemployed. But what we have to discuss as a society is what is the social contract between us and as a society and individuals, and for how long and what level and what kind of support people should expect. And I know there's a whole lot of work being done in terms of the Department of Education and Skills and the Department of Social Protection in terms of reorganising how we manage what are enormous budgets. The budgets, if you add FOSS to the IoTs, to community employment schemes, it is not a problem of money. It is a problem that we have been very poor at organising, delivering and matching the available opportunities to people in need of activation. And we didn't do it in the good times. There was still a cohort of Irish society in the most job-rich Ireland we've ever had, who neither had the skills nor the capacity nor the will to work. So again, these are issues that we've got to, again, face as a society, and they're not comfortable, but they must be faced. I think we need to also, one other area that we need to tackle in terms of discussion, and that is the balance between what I would call core public services, health, education, welfare, and then all that's done through the non-profit sector in Ireland. We have, believe it or not, over 12,000 non-profit organisations in Ireland. 8,000 of them are funded by the Irish state. Now, I don't know if we can afford this anymore, or do we know how much we're spending and how we're spending. And again, I just came across a very interesting study by a colleague of mine, Tony Fahy, and some others. They went back and looked at a number of different housing estates, and they estimated that there were 23 national level programmes directed area-based interventions, and of those it amounted to about $1 billion, about 688 million in terms of direct spend, and the rest then in terms of all these tax breaks that were given to renewal or whatever. But what was extraordinary about the study was that the Irish state could not tell them how much the groups were spending in the various housing estates. In Fatima Mansions, the community groups were accessing 17 different national programmes. In Myross, 22, and in Cranmore, about 15. And the spend was about 3,000 per household. Do we know what the benefits were and the outcomes were? And unfortunately, what was happening in all of this is that the people involved were spending most of their time filling out, dealing with the problems of grantsmanship. They weren't actually focusing on what they were doing. So again, I think we've got to get really tough and say that what we must protect are the frontline public services, and then strip away a lot of the rest as nice to have. But what it does mean is it means tackling vested interests. And when I say vested interests, I mean the hospital consultants, but also the community groups, or everyone who thinks that their thing is absolutely essential and must be funded. So these are the choices. So I'll end by saying, I'm not sure the decisions are actually that hard. I think they're politically really hard, because they're going to hit everyone and all parts of the country. But I do think that they must be framed in terms of choice. We now face choices that are intergenerational, that are in terms of different sectors. We face trade-offs, and those trade-offs have to be faced up to, because not facing up to them just means that we get into an even bigger mess that we're in, and the Irish will remain much more pessimistic. I'm surprised that I've managed to come to MacGill and not say one word about the EU, so I'm delighted to sit down now, having finished. Thank you.